Check, check. This is a test of the YouTube system. Hello
Hey,
there.
hi. You're Jonathan?
I am. Are you
Hi.
Stephen?
I am he. Yeah, that's your name right there. Good.
Outstanding. Welcome aboard. So yeah, a couple of housekeeping stuff. You should see live on YouTube in the corner. We're not broadcasting to any sort of audience. This is just for me to have a backup. So there's no peanut gallery for us
Fair
talking.
enough. Got it. Okay.
And I'm going to hit record to this computer so that I'll have our audio on separate tracks. And that's all the tech stuff.
All
And
right, good.
I
You
figured
definitely
I'd
have a
just
radio guy voice.
thanks. I was actually thinking about that with you too, about
Hmm.
hearing you debate and just the measured way that you speak.
Hmm.
That's one of the most effective tools you can have, is just not irritating your audience with your voice, right?
We're gonna
So
write that one down. Don't irritate the audience.
yeah, so it's just kind of it's just nice to see your presentation style and ability to communicate
Great.
with the
Yeah.
audience too. So
Good. Good.
that's part of what I wanted to dig into. So
So we
how
have a couple
about
of minutes. Tell me a
yeah,
little more about how you chose your name.
right. My background is I'll go all the way back to high school. I did Lincoln Douglas debate. I maxed out the number of points I could get for LD in the National
Nice.
Forensics League. So that's my nerd cred there. And I got paid $200 to do magic tricks at a company's summer picnic when I was 13 years old. So that
You're a
started.
rich young man. Look at that.
Oh yeah, I was just
200
rolling in
bucks.
it. Exactly. So that's what sent me down the path of performing and magic and mentalism. My mentor is James Randi, from the good old days. So so that's kind of my pedigree and background. And I've traveled the world, entertained the troops overseas, been out for America's Got Talent, all that kind of stuff as a mentalist. One of the most common things I would get after a show is, "Did you go to college for this?" Kind of like, what did you go to school for?
Yeah.
And then I'd tell them, I was like, "Oh yeah, I have a degree in painting." Like that's that's what my degree is in. Like,
Yeah.
wait, what? So enough people asked that over time I said, screw it, I'm going to make my own college. And then Mindreader University was just a placeholder for quite a while, where it would just be my post show swag and books and stuff. And
Nice.
then since the touring died down, I was like, I should fire up a podcast again and then just call it Mindreader University and have
Yeah.
guest professors on for whatever
Okay.
topics. So
I was actually kind
that's
of thinking you'd make my job easy. I would just sit here and you would do your mind reader thing and externalize whatever.
exactly. Well, that is the crux of kind of my work of consulting with entrepreneurs and businesses. I've spoken at BP and stuff, and mainly it's focused on, listen, the number one thing is nobody's a mind reader. If they were, then this problem would disappear.
Hmm.
I'm a mind reader, and I'm telling you that problem doesn't disappear. and, and the
Uh,
only way to really read somebody's mind, there's a secret to it. And then everybody goes, oh, what is it? And I'm like, I'm about to tell you. Ask them.
yeah,
That's the only way. That's the only way that you're going to get inside somebody's head.
that's right.
And then they're just like, I was hoping there was a trick. And I was like, that is the trick. That's it's not easy. It is not easy. So yeah, that's kind of it. The other part of it is um focusing on dating. People talking to my now fiance always have one of two reactions, which is, "Oh, that's great. You don't have to say a thing." Or the second one,
Hmm.
which is, "Oh Lord, that's got to be terrifying.
Hmm.
He's in there." So the first one is, "Oh, you want to abdicate your responsibility of voicing what you need out of life." And
Yeah.
two, the second one is, "What are you trying to hide? What?" Yeah. So
Uh,
yeah. So
so
that's
some
that's it.
fun territory for you.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the short pitch is, all right, how would your life or business be better if you could actually read minds? And then people go, "Oh, it would be this and that." And I go, "That's what I help people do without having to read minds."
Hmm. Nice.
And
Nice.
oh, okay. So yeah, that's kind of the background for me, and kind of my goal is to set you up to share your ideas and pontificate however long you would like without me interrupting.
Okay.
Um,
All right. So I shouldn't necessarily limit my questions to a minute or my answers to a minute or whatever. What do you?
Right. No, it's kind of long form. For kind of my mission for the podcast is for me, I mean, I like for us to have a conversation. The final product will be my part cut way down so that people listening aren't hearing me share the same stories over and over again, or,
Okay.
oh my God, this host, why doesn't he let the smart guest talk more? Like that,
Right.
let's
Good.
listen to them. So yeah, so I'll cut most of my part out. So yeah, you don't have to worry about leaving much room for
Okay.
me.
Long form. I have a kind of a hard close around 3.
Cool.
So an hour is good.
Yeah, yeah, you
Max?
got it.
Okay.
So
Good.
we'll stick that landing and make sure that we're out by 3.
Great. Thanks. Where are you
Yeah.
located physically, by the way?
I'm up in Andersonville in Chicago.
Oh, okay. So just down the road, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why I've been familiar with your work over the years, and
Hmm.
then Rockford. I was like, wait a minute, what? Just right around the corner. All right, that's
Yeah.
cool. So yeah.
All
So
right.
just to dig in, how about you introduce yourself? That way I don't bungle it and it's exactly how you like it.
Okay. So when shall we go? We can start
We're
now?
going. I got all the recording. I'll cut
Okay.
out all
We'll do
that
that.
fluff and then
All
that'll
right.
be it.
Well, I'm a professor of philosophy at Rockford University in Illinois, and I have the luxury of teaching at a liberal arts institution, which typically means small classes and mostly with students who actually want to be at university, which is a nice change. And then, of course, with the professor lifestyle comes usually lots of time for writing and reading, and a certain amount now of travel with public lectures based on my books and related topics. I think, yeah, personally, I'm kind of a hybrid Canadian American now. You might hear that in my voice, but while Canadian and American culture are perhaps 95% identical, there are some interesting differences, and I feel both closely. So that's me.
Got it. So a lot of overlap, but those differences are different. So
Hmm,
that's good to point out. Now,
sure,
a-
yes.
as a professor of philosophy, why philosophy? Why is that important, right? Can't we
Hmm.
just all make our decisions, be a good person, and take life as it comes? Why even worry about these old stuffy people who wrote books 400 years ago?
Hmm.
What value is
Yeah.
there?
Well, the idea that you can make decisions, that's already a philosophical choice. The idea that you're going to be a good person, that also is a philosophical choice. And then what it is to be a good person also requires that you do some philosophy. So kind of interesting if you just survey most parents now compared to parents a little before 1920, so it would be almost exactly a century. So, you ask parents in 1919, what do you think is the number one trait your child should have to be a good child? And the number one trait was obedience. That's what it is to be a good little boy or a good little girl. And now, of course, most parents would say, well, um, be creative, right? Or something like that. And that's a huge cultural shift, but it was driven by philosophy. Now, to answer in more detail, I mean, if I'm going to be good, well, what is the good? If I'm going to just make decisions for my life, well, what is my life? And what do I want to accomplish in my life? Do I think that my life is, say 80 years on this planet and that's it? So I should make sure I get it done in the next 80 years. I don't have time to waste. Or do I think that no, really, this life is not that important? And my philosophy teaches me that the good stuff or the important stuff happens after I die, and so really I should be thinking about preparing for death. So already we're bumping into philosophical territory, and why it matters about reading sometimes the old guys 400 years or so who were writing and thinking about those questions is that to a large extent, we live in a culture that is driven by the previous generation's intellectuals and politicians, but those politicians and intellectuals are driven by earlier generations. So I often think, for example, of my particular case. I come from on my dad's side a long line of Canadian farmers, and so there's a question, why am I not a Canadian farmer? And one of the reasons is that I grew up in a culture that said, you can become anything you want. And it's not necessarily the case that what your parents did is what you have to do, and you don't have choices about that, uh, and so forth. But of course, we do know lots of parents teach their children to not think beyond options that are presented to them by their parents' beliefs, lifestyles, and so on. So the reason why, actually, I think of another example here to go back to the 1920s. I don't know if you know this, but life expectancy for Canada and the United States, among the richest and most developed nations in the world by the time of the early 20th century, was in the high 50s. And now it is for young women in the low 80s and almost 80 for young men. And this will be shocking if you go back 2 centuries ago to 1820 or so. Average life expectancy for Americans was in the 30s. So if you're,
Really? That's
yes,
amazing.
that's right. I have these numbers almost memorized. 35 point something for white males, 37 for white females, 36 for Black females, and 33 point something for Black males. And those are the American numbers. And the racial difference largely due to slavery, since there was still 1820s slavery in the southern part of the United States. But it's also interesting, of course, the gender difference or the sex difference is important as well. But then you ask the question, why in 2 centuries has life expectancy more than doubled? And we don't think about it, but a lot of it has to do with philosophy. So we do our politics in a kind of democratic Republican fashion, but that doesn't happen automatically. That depends on the idea that most people, the majority of people, are smart enough to think about important things and argue about it and debate and vote. And most of the time, they're going to get it mostly right. And then if they make a mistake, they will change their minds, and it will be a self-correcting process, but a peaceful process. But that's a very philosophical set of assumptions about human nature. And of
Right.
course, a lot of it has to do with science and technology. But science and technology depend on a scientific method, depends on a lot of experimentation and engineering. And that's a very philosophical approach to the world, that we can look at the world, take it apart, figure out how it works, put things back together in a way that we think is better. And we can work out the scientific tools of logic and mathematics and experimental method. Uh, and of
Yeah.
course, if you're going to have a culture that does a lot of science and technology and engineering, that's very expensive stuff. If you think of all of those multi-million-dollar labs out there, where does all of that money come from? Well, you have to have a very rich society to be able to support all of those researchers and so on.
Right.
So yeah, part of what happened a couple hundred years ago is that we started not only doing science and technology more systematically in democratic republicans, but we had an open, free economy, and we started to do free market capitalism. We started letting everybody choose their own careers and trade with anybody. And that again is a very philosophical move, that instead of saying,
Right.
yeah, God is going to provide for you, or the state will provide for you, that we think you can provide for yourself. And we're going to unleash the entrepreneurs, and people are going to develop modern corporations and logistical supply chains and innovation and again. So the point then is that philosophy is behind science, free market capitalism, democratic republicanism, and so forth. So I don't know why we live the way we do. It wasn't automatic. It was philosophers 400 years ago made some arguments and won.
It's easy to see that scientific method is great for rocket ships and physics. Yeah. But, the right thing to do back in the 20s was to be
Mm,
obedient, and the right thing to do nowadays is different. So therefore, all good is contextual and culturally relevant, right? There's
mm,
there's no universal good because it all depends on what culture you're talking about. So let's drill into that because that usually hints at there is no universal good. It's all relative. And that kind of cultural relativist, anything could be
sure.
justified, there is no universal good, is
Right.
part of a rather pervasive philosophy that has tendrils in every single part of life nowadays. So how do we get there? What is that? And
Mm,
can we pin that down? Because part of that is the no true postmodernist fallacy is everybody goes, "Oh, that's not really what postmodernism is. Oh,
mm.
that's not really what this is. It's really this." And how do you pin down somebody or an idea that is in its nature saying there is no solid ground to stand on?
Yeah, well, that's a rich and complicated question, right? That you're putting out with a lot of aspects, right? So yes, at one sense, or at one level, cultural relativism is true as a descriptor, right? There are different cultures now, different cultures historically, and they have had different ideas about what is right and wrong. And then over time, right, cultures have changed. Now, if you want to turn that into a normative claim, that there, this hard to state without being paradoxical. That the universal truth is that there are no universal truths, right? Or
Mhm.
the good thing to believe that everyone should believe is that there are no universal goods, right? Then we have a
Right. The
problem.
only the only one universally acceptable way of looking at things is that there is no universally acceptable way of looking at things.
Yes,
And
that's
that's
right.
a contradiction. That you
Yes,
can't
that's
build
right.
anything on that though.
Right. So one thing you can do then is to say negatively, when you go down the cultural relativist road, you end up in some places you don't want to end up in. So one of them is this kind of epistemological one or logical contradiction one, that it's very hard to state the position without contradicting yourself. Right. So that's one. But then also, the usual temptation then is to say, well, if cultural relativism is true, then we can't really say that slavery was wrong, right? Or that the Nazis, right, were wrong, right? Or those parts of the world that are still, practicing clitoridectomy on little girls are wrong. They just have a different way of doing things according to their cultural traditions. And so most people at that point want to back off and say, all right, now, right, we have a problem here. But that then does leave you the challenge that drives cultural relativism, which is then to say, well, if I wanted to say that in some sense moral values are objective, right, and they should be universal, and those are two related but different claims, we do have the very difficult problem philosophically of saying, well, in what way are they objective? And it's a challenge because saying something like slavery is wrong seems to me more difficult than saying grass is green, right? Or that 2 + 2 = 4. And I think that's right, because moral propositions are more complicated cognitive propositions that we are making. And unfortunately, we've just not been very good in the philosophical world at doing the philosophical work. Now, there are some historical reasons for this. One is that in the modern world, which in historical time is really still young a young kid, the new kid on the block, just a few centuries. And we do have to put that in context that for not hundreds but thousands of years, the dominant moral positions have been religious positions that have said, yes, there are universal truths, but they come from this kind of largely unknowable being in another dimension who just told them to some guys in the desert 3,000 years ago, and you just have to accept them on faith. And if you start to ask questions, we will punish you in various ways. So we do unfortunately have a long cultural tradition as, literally thinking of morality as some sort of magical, mysterious, otherworld thing that we're not supposed to think of. We're just supposed to obey and do. So it takes a long time for then people to get to the point where they are willing to say, maybe I should think about moral issues. And but then of course it's complicated because moral science, as I think of it, is a more complicated discipline than chemistry and biology and physics, and those are already quite complicated enough. This is still by way of preamble. If you think about, human beings are largely psychological beings, and our psychological life is incredibly rich, but we're still at the infancy stages of understanding how the human psyche works, right? Our emotions and our drives and our memories and our rational faculties and our observation and all of those things. I mean, you have to have, I think, a good theory of psychology to have a good theory of morality. And then, of course, we do know there are lots of different ways in which individuals can live more or less successfully, and lots of different ways of organizing societies more or less successfully. And sorting out all of the dimensions of success and failure takes a lot of very good social science. And we are still in the early stages of doing all of that. But that said, at one level, I would say, morality and showing that it is objective, right, and universal is, because the most important thing about human beings is to say that we're moral creatures because we're not instinctual creatures like many other animals. We're not born knowing what's good or bad. We have to think about these things and acquire and learn and practice. So right from the get-go, we need to be moral agents, but that's universal to the species. Every human being needs to learn and practice and try out various things and be experimental. And of course, you see kids in the schoolyard or in the playground, doing exactly this, and brothers and sisters and so forth. It's moral experimenting. All what works, what doesn't work, what principles are going to help us get where we want to go, and me where I want to go, and so forth. So it is a hard learning process, and part of it does get driven by social science, and there's lots of variables, and we're still in the early stages of it. But I would say the way to do it, since we don't have a huge amount of time, is but to step outside of the human condition and say, the core concepts that we need to get off the ground are not only that human beings make choices and need to learn. We're not instinctual and automatic, and so that makes us moral beings. So, and it's to say some things are good and some things are bad, and then since you are a chooser, you need to choose the good over the bad, but you first need to learn what the difference between good and bad is. So if there are going to be moral facts that are objective, then we have to be able to point to and identify actual objective facts in the world, and they would have to be the same facts for the entire species. So what would that look like? Now, humans are more complicated, and a good methodological principle is always to take a complicated thing and consider a simpler example. So let's consider the example of an animal. It's not a moral agent per se, but at least on the concepts of good or bad, does it make sense to say that there are things that are good for squirrels and bad for squirrels? Good for eagles and bad for eagles. Now, normally we'll start saying, well, yeah, sure, it makes sense that there are some things that are good for eagles and bad for eagles. Well, what is that? What makes something good for an eagle, say? And you start to say things like, well, the eagle is a biological creature, and as a biological creature, it has certain needs, certain, say, nutritional needs. And this is not, just that, a God-given mystical insight. It's a natural fact about the eagle that it has certain nutritional needs. And it's universal to all of the eagles because they are all the same kind of species, so they all have the same general kinds of needs. So it's an objective universal fact about the eagle that it has certain biological needs. It's also an objective fact for the eagle that there are some things out in its environments. I don't know, let's say rabbits that have certain protein and other structures, right, that match the nutritional needs of the eagle. So then we can say the rabbits are good for eagles. And now I've introduced the good term, right? But what I'm saying is it's not some sort of intrinsic goodness floating around even out there in the world, but rather there are things in the environment, rabbits that have certain nature or certain identity. There are these other things in the world, eagles that have certain nutritional needs, and there's a relationship between those. And the rabbits, if they can be ingested by the eagles, that will do things for the eagle that enable it to survive and flourish. And that's what we mean, right, as good. So then we can start saying, by extension, the eagle has eyes, and having those eyes is good for the eagle because it enables it to see the environment and spot the rabbits that it can then catch and use to satisfy its needs. The eagle has wings, and keeping its wings clean and in good condition is good for the eagle so that it can fly, that it can capture. It has claws, right, and so on. So here we're talking about the needs of the eagle, the capacities, the wings, the eyes, the capacities of the eagle, various actions that it would engage in, seeing, flying, hunting, and then entities out in the environment like rabbits and squirrels and so forth. And all of those then in a relationship are what we mean of what's good for the eagle. So it's good for the eagle to use its eyesight to fly, to hunt, to catch rabbits, to take them apart, to eat them, to digest it, because that enables the eagle to live. And what is bad for the eagle is the opposite of those things. If you pluck the feathers out of the eagle, that's bad for the eagle, right? If you try to feed it sand instead of rabbits, that's bad for the eagle, right? If you blind the eagle, that's bad for the eagle. So good and bad are grounded in objective and universal, but relational facts about the world. Now that's a relatively simple story for the eagles, but if we are willing to say, yeah, good and bad, it's not kind of magical or supernatural, we're not just making it up, there are objective facts that give rise to it. And the same thing is going to then be true for human beings. We are not eagles, but we have a different nature, we have different needs, we have different capacities, we are living in an environment, and there are things that we need to be able to do in the environment to get the things that we need. But the difference is that for us, we also are choice makers, right? Because unlike the eagle, we need to use our minds to think, to discover, and train ourselves instead of it being instinctual and automatic. So that's the beginning of a story of how I would argue that morality is, in fact, it's not just culturally made up, it's not just God imposed. There's the beginnings of an objective science for it, and that would be how we would defeat cultural relativism.
I like that a lot. And to the point of what's good for the eagle tends to be bad for the rabbit,
Yes,
right?
that's right.
And the same kind of story applies to
And if I
humans.
can then say, what's good for the rabbit is bad for the grass, right?
Right,
And
right.
so on.
So it seems like a zero-sum game, but in one dimension, human beings have kind of thought around that problem.
Good,
And to
yes.
me, that's what business is.
Mm,
Business is the process of solving those needs in a win-win fashion, not a zero-sum fashion.
yes.
A lot of people only understand business as winning and losing. I got the gig, you didn't. Haha, you lose.
Hmm.
But business is the exchange of value.
Yes,
I value your money more than the goods I have. You value my goods more than the money you have. We
right.
voluntarily exchange and we both leave with more value than when we started.
Right.
That's magic. Like
Now,
that is
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. It's magic metaphorically, but I know what you mean. But what's really behind the magic is that, right, unlike the limitations that are placed on an eagle, right, or a rabbit, is that they don't have a rational capacity that we have. And so, yeah, it's not the case that for human beings, once our knowledge reaches a certain point, that we are limited to kind of just harvesting resources that are pre-existing and created by other forces in the environment. Because we're smart, we can do science, we can do technology. And as you're pointing out, we can develop norms of doing business with each other that increase the net stock of resources and increase the value of those resources. And so that means we don't need to be in a zero sum or a win-lose transaction, right? So the scientist, for example, who discovers a new hybrid of corn, and so then you say on an acre of land, I'm just making these numbers up, right? But we can get, 500 bushels of corn out of this acre of land instead of 125 bushels. That is a purely intellectual and then experimental, right? And then a business applied proposition. But we can do that as human beings and make the land in that case, 4 times as productive. So then in that case, it's not the case, that if I get a bushel of wheat, as a result of this process, that somehow somebody's going out or without a bushel of wheat. We've increased the amounts of bushels significantly.
Right.
Now, this is an interesting question, though, about why that zero-sum mentality that you mentioned still is so widespread. And again, I think there are some deep historical roots for that. And partly, I think it does come out of my profession of, moral philosophy has largely been immoral, right, or amoral, right? So it has largely taught over the centuries that people who are interested in making money or getting money are bad people, and they are of a lower moral order. And it's interesting to think of it until you get to the modern world, the people who are at the top of this is cultural relativism for you, right? But the people who are at the top of the heap, if you think in feudal society, you've got the kings and the aristocrats, and then you've got the clergy, right, in the church, and those are the 2 top pillars. But neither of them does business work or grows food or crops. Instead, if you're the king or the aristocrat, you become the king or aristocrat basically by killing the other king and taking his stuff, right? So it's a conquest model. And from your perspective, the people who work with their hands and grow the food and make the clothes, even, they're a lower order of being. And then on the religious side, right, the idea is that you survive by alms. So it's the lower orders who are supposed to produce all of the food and then give it to you as an act of charity so you can engage in purely spiritual activities because you're not materialistic and money grubbing, right, and so on. Now, I'm presenting slightly cartoon versions of these, but those are long-standing cultural traditions. And both of them have the view that your cultural elite and your moral cultural elite, they have no clue how wealth is created. It's completely invisible to them. And they have a kind of class snobbishness that goes with it that says that the people who are doing those things are of a lower order. So it's not really until you get into the modern world that you have people who are working with their hands, working with their minds, creating value. They become a real phenomenon. And it's a long time for people to rethink all of those cultural moral preconditions to give dignity and moral worth to those individuals and to say, no, it's not just a matter of somehow stuff gets made, and if you get more, I get less. That somehow we can actually create more. And that's a mind shift of epic proportions. And we're still in the early stages of it where really only a few people grasp it.
Right, because a part of where that old style of thinking shows up is in the proud battle cry of seize the means of production,
Mm,
and the belief that owning the physical thing is what makes the world go,
mm,
instead of recognizing it's the mind that could imagine such a thing
yeah,
as that machine, and
right.
then apply reason and time and energy into reshaping reality into a new dynamic that creates value for mankind,
Right.
you can't steal that mind.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's important. So you're pushing back and saying there are people who are in the early modern world, and you're getting close to a kind of Marxism here. Is probably the most famous, but it's not only Marx. There's lots of people in this category where they will recognize that yes, things need to be made and produced, but they will then have a very reductionistic or low-grade materialistic understanding of what goes into production. So yeah, there's land, and there has to be land to grow food, and there needs to be tools and capital equipment, but they don't really have a good understanding for where those tools and the capital equipment come from. And so then they have the idea that somehow, once those machines are made, that we just need to grab them, and then the machines will of themselves continue to go, and we can extract the process. So yes, the point that you're getting to is exactly right, that behind the machines is a whole lot of thinking and a whole lot of understanding, science and engineering, and in terms of business process, that enables those machines to go. And so that's where you're talking about the most important kind of capital, which is human capital, that people have knowledge, they have know-how, they have character, they have habits, they have processes right in place, because the machines don't go of themselves. So, I mean, for example, there's lots of times this experiment has been done where it would say, okay, if you look at some poor part of the world, they don't seem to be able to grow food enough to feed their people. And then, well, why don't they? Well, then we might try out a version of this hypothesis. Well, it's because they don't have enough capital equipment. So let's buy 1,000 tractors from North America or Europe, and we're going to ship them to this poor part of the country, and we're going to give the tractors to the people, and then the problem, right, will be solved. Well, yeah, how do you drive a tractor, right? And how do you understand, right, the soil mechanics, and how do you have a logistical infrastructure, and how do you capitalize tractor production so you're not just depending on tractors being delivered to you in another generation when these tractors wear out? All of that scientific, technological, and business infrastructure, which is inside people's heads, that's the more important capital that has to be getting right there. Instead, you just deliver them the tractors, they're just going to rust in the field. And that's what happened to billions of dollars worth of capital equipment. Right. So yes, the mind is the most important asset.
And a lot of what we're hinting at and pointing to shows up in business ethics, which most people think is a contradiction in terms.
Oh my.
Kind of coming back, right? Because they understand the cartoonish fat cat smoking a cigar and stealing the wealth from the people who actually created it, that whole way of understanding it.
Yeah.
There's an environment where I have seen most of these ideas being played out most clearly in a dimension that you've spoken about before, but not extensively as much as the business side of things, which is kind of what I wanted to talk to you about, is in the world of art. That's kind of my background. Is I have a degree in painting, in studio art, and I love painting portraits on an iPad using the world's most advanced technology to celebrate human beauty. Okay, cool.
That is cool.
Thank you. But most of the people that I was in school with, and anybody who calls themselves an artist, has the fundamental belief and philosophy that, oh, I shouldn't sully myself with commerce. I'm not a commercial artist. I'm a real artist. If I'm not a poor, starving artist, I therefore am not legitimate. There's all sorts of interlocking philosophy here that plays out in the art world that I don't think a lot of people, one, know about, or two, appreciate or understand.
Yeah.
So I would love to talk within that framework of the art world.
Yeah. Now, again, there's a lot of rich material packed into that that question, but yes, my view is about artists. That obviously art is a very philosophical enterprise. You're going to spend a week, a month, a year on something. What makes that worth your time to do? Well, it's got to be something very important to you, that you want to externalize it, and you also want to communicate that to other people. So art is a very value-laden enterprise. And the things that inspire the great artists and inspire the great reactions are always things that are pushing our important value buttons and philosophical buttons about the meaning of life, love, adventure, beauty, death, right, and so on. So artists and philosophers really should see themselves as allies. Now, that, of course, is a very difficult and ambitious project. And so the psychology, I think, becomes very important here. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people who are attracted to art, they do start to sabotage themselves. I think it's normal to start to have some doubts about whether you have what it takes to be an artist of the stature that you know is historically possible. And whatever your own personal goals as an artist are. That's not unique to artists, that's unique to anybody in any field. If you set high ambitions, you're likely going to have some self-doubts about your ability to achieve those high ambitions. And one way of insulating yourself is to say, well, if I don't make it as an artist, I can't make a career as an artist. It doesn't mean that I'm a failed artist. Right? It means that there's something wrong with the world, right, and not with me. That the world has too many Philistines, right, in it, or people who just don't get it, or who care more about money than true art. And so one thing I would say is, be very careful in your personal psychology, particularly when you're young, not to do these self-sabotaging things, right? And to set yourself up for victimization. Embrace the possibility that maybe you're not as good as you think, but that doesn't matter. The important thing is you still need to try as best as you possibly can. Now, another part of it, though, is, there are some long-standing cultural traditions that, once again, put the artist, I think artists should be on a pedestal, right? But put them on the wrong kind of pedestal, that in some sense, right, that art is in this immaterial, spiritual, higher dimension, that maybe if you're an artist, it's because you've received inspiration from, and if you think of the roots of that word, in spirit, that somehow the spirits have entered into me and it's them who is making me, or who are making me do what I want to do. So all of that language, sets you up for then saying, if you are an artist, then by definition, you're not supposed to be interested in more materialistic types of considerations. And that's even in the modern decadent materialist West, still a cultural holdout in some cultural sectors, and the high arts is one of them. So the way I would caution younger artists against that is to say that, no, look, you're an artist, you're a human being. And yes, we have minds and emotions and passions, but we also have bodies and physicals, and there is the physical world, and the whole shebang, right, is the territory of art. You don't want to say that art is only about, right, certain things. And so obviously, if you get into issues of, sex, it can become pornography. So you need to be sensitive to that line, but you don't want to say that art shouldn't be about sex, right? That sex is a perfectly legitimate topic. Business, we know, can be extraordinarily creative and entrepreneurial and innovative. And the rewards of business can be living a rich lifestyle. So you don't want to, from the get-go as an artist, to say that this whole domain of human lifestyle is off limits, Rich, to me. That's just going to limit yourself as an artist. The other thing I would say as an artist, and I think we all know this in our bones, that there's something profoundly honoring about money and commerce. So if you are an artist, right, and you do something and you've put your heart and soul into it and your mind and your best effort, and you think it's great, right, by your standards of whatever art is. And you start showing it to people, and the usual reaction you will get, of course, is people saying, "That's interesting," right? And then, right, walking away, which of course is their way of saying it's actually not very interesting, and I don't want to talk about it, right, very much anymore. So it's a polite way of expressing disinterest or dislike, and getting away with it. But what you want, obviously, first and foremost, is to live up to your own standards in the creation of your art. But we are social beings, and we do want to connect with other people on things that we think are important. So to the extent that our art embodies something important for us, we want other people to respond to that. And it is a profound social connection when someone understands what you are trying to do in your artwork, and they respond emotionally and intellectually to your artwork the way that you do. That's a profound connection. And let me just finish, this is the final thought on this. If that person then is willing to say, "I would like to buy this work," and they get out their checkbook or they pull out their wallet or purse and give you money for that artwork, that is a profoundly honoring statement. They are willing to put their money where their mouth is. They want to take that into their life and presumably make it a part of their life. So the money is, of course, a material thing. It enables you to survive further and make a living, right, as an artist. But that money also has profound symbolic value to you as an artist. So I would caution artists not to buy into the cheap anti-money, anti-business, anti-commercialism mantra that is out there. Just as in any area of life, commercial success usually means deep value success, and that applies to art as well.
So that is multiple great insights, and a
Good,
way
thanks.
that I've seen that unfold for myself in kind of the most frustrating way is understanding that art is the expression of the artist's most fundamental core values of what they treasure the most about being alive.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. It has to be that profoundly important if you're going to spend a day, a year creating this thing with your time and energy. Okay, so there's that piece of the equation. And then my deepest pet peeve with that is an artist saying whatever the audience takes away from it is okay.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever the viewer experiences is okay.
Yeah.
Well, why did you even create something in the first place? It's the same thing as
It's a
an
cop-out.
orator. Right. It's an orator or a speaker getting to the podium. Everybody's there to hear what they're saying, and then they just say random words and saying the meaning you took away from this is your meaning. It's
Yeah.
like, no, you have a duty to create your vision and communicate that with your audience so that the people who will resonate with it can find it and experience it. So
Yeah.
that whole, oh, it's whatever, to me is the heart of the cultural relativism, nothing means anything, nothing can mean anything
Yeah.
philosophy of life, and it just destroys all the effort the artist is putting into creating in the first place.
Yeah. Like, that's an important insight. I think it goes back to your earlier question about the difference between commercial artists and thematic artists, right? Or fine artists. I don't really like fine artists. I prefer thematic artist. There is a legitimate distinction there, and there is such a thing as selling out to commercialism, right? So if you have something important to say or express as an artist, and it's important, but you take the easy road and you get a job that pays more money and you give up on that artistic dream, then that's a personal value judgment. You might be able to justify it, but you do know that you have sold out for the sake of money, that you're not realizing a certain ambition. But I also think there is a legitimate kind of commercial artist. You have a certain set of skills, and you like the exercise of the skills as an artist, and you don't feel particularly moved to say anything in particular. And so you are perfectly fulfilled with other people coming to you and saying, would you, paint this landscape, right? Or would you, design something for our corporation? I think that can be perfectly fine. So then other people are coming up with the theme or the topic or the subject, and you are exercising your skills, and that's perfectly legitimate. Um, the thematic artist, though, also wants to say, and most thematic artists will resist the idea that they're just kind of hired guns with a skill set, that what they want is for the art to be their unique individual expression, that they have something to say, and they will then resist the idea, that, I did this portrait, say, well, make the person's hair a little longer. No, that's not your choice, right? Or I'd rather her dress is blue instead of green. That's not your choice. This is my project, and you can like it or leave it, and that should be a bottom line. So I think the important thing is just to recognize what kind of artist you are. Are you a thematic artist, in which case jealously guard your prerogative to control the artwork all the way through? But then, of course, to the extent that you are putting it out there for other people, you do have this, it's not I wouldn't use the word duty. I would say it's a personal commitment that you made to make sure that it comes out in a way that other human beings who are thoughtful and sensitive human beings can understand, right, what you're doing. And then the fact that there's a commercial transaction should be honoring rather than a sullying. But on the other hand, if you are a commercial artist and you don't really have any ambition to be a thematic artist, and you've got great skills and you just love, not knowing what you're going to be asked to create next, that's also a perfectly legitimate way, right, to make a living. But what you can't do, I think, is mix those two inside your own soul.
That's a great detail. And in the culture of art and thematic art and the art world has been the process of kind of not undermining the celebration of beauty, but just
Mm,
kind of the removal of beauty or the celebration of human spirit. It seems more like an intellectual exercise of what can we cut away before we've cut too much.
mm,
And now it's more of an exploration of how little than it is a creation of an idea. So
yeah.
where does that land?
Yeah, that's interesting. Again, another interesting complex of things there. So, I think beauty is an important artistic value, but I would say it's just one of many. Right? In many cases, depending on how broadly or narrowly we're considering, right? We want to have the idea that life is beautiful, and it can be, and there's a lot of beauty in the world, and we want to celebrate and dwell upon, right, the beauty in the world. But there are other values that artists will explore, the challenge, right, and adventure, and overcoming adversity. And in many cases, if you're struck by the important value is to set great goals for yourself, and life is going to be an adventure with challenges and ups and downs and adversity, then pain and suffering and disappointment and failure are also going to be a part of your artwork. And so, necessarily some ugly and painful things are going to come in. And so if you are going with the assumption, that art is only about beauty, then I think you're going to set yourself up for frustration as an artist. And so, it might not be particularly beautiful, but in that case, your broader positive value is going to be, say, triumph, right, or success, or even it might not even be about that end result, but it might be just about the process of adventure. It's the process that you are trying to get to instead of the end result. Point is that there are lots of values aside from beauty. So I think the broader is whether you philosophically are committed to the idea that the good outweighs the bad or the bad outweighs the good in the world? And what is the dominant theme in your artwork going to be? And so, when you look at the history of art, not even all of the great artists are optimistic. There are a lot of them that are focused on the pessimistic, but they do an excellent job at expressing and communicating, right, that pessimistic philosophical theme. Now, a sub-variation on that is in the second part of your question, where, and I think this is largely a peculiarity of the 20th century art world, where art has always been philosophical, but the art world became captured by a certain kind of philosophical project. So artists have always asked, well, what is art? Right? And then there's all these definitions and theories, and a lot of it is artists experimenting with their understanding of what art is. So is it an intellectual enterprise? And so the important thing is to communicate a certain theme. Is it an emotional exercise? And so it's a matter of expressing or evoking emotions in one's audience. Is it a pleasing to the eye or ear exercise? Not too intellectual, not too emotional, but what we're striving for is kind of perceptual veridicality and realism and so on. And so the artists are operating within a certain philosophical understanding of what art is. And then mostly the artists that became the great artists were the ones that realized that art kind of pushes all of those buttons, right? It appeals to our senses, our intellects, our passions. It's kind of a whole body and mind experience at its best. But the experiment that you came to, or that you mentioned in your question, came to be when artists, partly at the end of the 19th century, but certainly into the early 20th century, were in part impressed with developments in science. And so everybody had some working understanding of scientific methodology. And scientific methodology, in large part, is taking complexes and breaking them down to their component parts and trying to reduce things to the smallest parts possible, and then maybe later see if you can rebuild it as well. So this is a bit of a cartoon, but this idea of reductionism. And so then if we take something that's super complicated like art is, so it seems to have all of these aspects and dimensions to it, can we take art apart and break it down into all of its constituent elements? And one way of doing that is to say, all right, so here's an artwork that's got all of these elements. It's got a theme, it's got color, it's got composition, it's got texture, it's got this, that, and the other thing. What happens if we start taking some of these things away? So what if we start to say, art, maybe has a theme, maybe a painting, it's an array of colors and perspective and textures, but it's telling a little story. And then you start to say things, well, maybe if we take the story away, right? And we say that art is not really about telling a story. That's what we do in poetry and literature and so on. So we want to be painters, and paint is just, arrangements of color on a two-dimensional surface. So let's get rid of story. And so then you get a rejection of narrative in painting. And then they start to say, well, one of the things that has preoccupied artists since the Renaissance has been vertical perception with respect to perspective and so forth. And so we're trying to make a two-dimensional surface look like it's got three-dimensional spatiality. And maybe that's an illusion. And if we're going to try to get to the truth of artists, maybe what we should do is try to get rid of that illusion. Right? Or maybe we should just say that, three-dimensionality, that's what sculpture does. Painting to be, let's see if it's still painting, if it really just is two-dimensionality. So then we get rid of perspective, right, in our paintings. We intentionally flatten the presentation. And so forth. So then what we're doing is, well, we've gotten rid of perspective, we've gotten rid of narration. What's left? Well, we've got colors and textures, right, and so on. And you can continue to play that reductionist game. And I think that is an explanation for not all, but a large part of what was going on in early 20th century art. So it becomes this reductionist game until, what if we stop saying that it doesn't have to be that a perceptual object that is carrying some sort of conceptual meaning? Maybe it's just the concept. It's not the perceptual object anymore. So I just start putting words on a canvas instead of trying to paint what those words are about. So then we've gotten rid of perceptual objects and we've just got concepts, and now we're into conceptual art and so on. So yes, and a certain amount of that is fine, I think, as artistic experiments. I think the problem in the case of 20th century art is if you don't recognize failed experiments as failed experiments, or if you kind of pretend that what's just an experiment actually is some great innovation and some sort of profundity in the art world. So that's some interesting territory.
I love it. So to kind of put a bow on it is philosophy is important because it's the expression of meaning of what it is to be human. And that unfolds in the territory of art, commerce, interpersonal relationships.
Oh,
And
yes.
and that's why there really aren't separate domains. It's just areas of interest to unfold what it means to be human.
Absolutely. That's very well put. Yes. So, yeah, all of us as humans, and in a way, this is the Renaissance man, right, ideal, or we say the Renaissance human ideal. That we are full humans with a lot of capacities, and we want to develop all of our capacities. And the world is not parceled into different domains, even if we divide things up into physics, chemistry, and economics, and so forth. It's all, excuse me, it's all out there, and we want to experience all of it. And then other people, sorry, I'm losing my voice a little.
Yeah, no worries.
We want to have full experiences with not uh, with all sorts of people, right? In business, in romance, in friendship, in sports, in art, and so forth. So, yes, philosophy is about discovering all of that and sorting out what really is valuable in all of that, and then letting that inform the kinds of individuals we become, so that we can, in fact, lead the fullest lives possible.
That's a stuck landing if I've ever heard one.
All right. Thank
Well,
you
you'll
for the
call
great
that good.
questions.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, I have no clue when it will go live. I'll give you a heads up, all that kind
Sure.
of good stuff. And yeah, is there anything else I can do for you, or that you'd like to know about? What can I help with?
No, just that was fun. Yeah, I appreciate that you're bringing a lot of stuff to the table. You got the technical
Thank
skills
you.
and the interest in art and philosophy and business. Yeah, so you're kind of Renaissance man yourself. So it comes through in your persona.
Thank you.
All
That's
right.
been one of the biggest challenges is helping people understand I'm not just a performer, not just an artist, not just a business consultant, and helping
Great.
them wrap their head around, oh, this is possible. So
Yeah,
yeah.
nice. All right, Jonathan, all the best. Yeah, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. Awesome. All right. Catch you
Yep.
later.
Bye for now.
Bye.